All right, let's say good afternoon to Carmi Levy. He is our CTV tech analyst, joins us every Thursday afternoon. Carmi, I got to start with this story because this has been generating a lot of buzz, but it does tie into tech, kind of. This is about an employee at RBC, right, charged, and they caught him, by the way. This goes back a couple of months, but it's only making news now. So he managed somehow to access Prime Minister Mark Carney's personal data, and apparently tried to access Justin Trudeau's as well, but the Justin Trudeau he found was not Justin Trudeau, the former Prime Minister. But that aside, it does make people wonder. We've heard, of course, about bank scams and all kinds of stuff. How easy was it for something like this to happen?
Well, the fact that it happened at all, I think, illustrates that it was ridiculously easy, that, once this employee signed into whatever RBC system he was given access to, he essentially had the keys to the kingdom, and that shouldn't be the case. Banks should have more compartmentalized systems in place so that you need to re-authenticate on each system in order to validate that you deserve to be there, whereas that was not the case in this case. And this investigation went back 2 years. In other words, they started detecting weird things starting 2 years ago, but he was only arrested in July, and we only found out about it now. So there are a whole lot of questions here that really suggest very lax internal controls within RBC. And I think what frightens me about this is if it can happen to the Prime Minister, it can happen to anyone.
Right.
The relationship that we have with our banks and all of our personal information and financial information on file, well, are they ensuring that all of their employees are on the up and up? Are they putting appropriate controls in place to stop this kind of thing from happening? We need answers. And right now, obviously, RBC not saying a whole lot, but this really should shake us all to our core. We thought the banking system was safe. That is obviously not the case.
By the way, to your point, right, if they could do this to get at Mark Carney's data, imagine, as you just said, what they can do to get at anybody's data. But beyond just RBC here, do we have a problem across the sector, across the banking sector, do you think?
I think we do, in my IT career, and I've worked in IT. I worked in the financial services industry, largely for investment companies and insurance companies, and we had very strict rules in place that if you didn't have a legitimate reason to access a particular system, well, then you didn't get it. And so, if I wanted to, if I was, for example, I was a project manager at one point. If I was working on a project on a particular system, I had to go through all sorts of security loops and hoops to get at that system. And if I couldn't meet the standards, I didn't get access to it, and I had to find some other project to work on. So obviously, some organizations seem to have tighter internal controls. But this particular case, at least what we know about it so far, we'll learn more over time. But just the fact that this happened at all, and the fact that it persisted for as long as it did, suggests that those controls weren't there. And I think this is across the industry. I think a lot of banks, it costs money to do this. It sometimes slows down the pace of business. It can be an annoyance to have that much security internally. Workers complain about it because it slows them down. And I think the entire industry needs to kind of look at this and look in a mirror and go, I think we need to do better.
Let me move on to speaking of hacks on a much, much bigger scale. This is a big story earlier in the week as well. Massive telecom threat. This was discovered in New York while the UN General Assembly was in session. Now, I understand this goes back a while, but it could have, had it not been caught, I guess, been activated and basically brought down the entire communication system in New York. What's the story?
Yeah, this is a frightening story. So the Secret Service had actually been doing an investigation into general threats to the telecommunications system. And they discovered there were a number of locations in New York. They're basically like small data centers with a whole bunch of computer servers in which you could plug in SIM cards. And those are exactly the same SIM cards that most of us have in our smartphones. It's what allows our smartphone to authenticate onto the wireless network. If you don't have a SIM card, you're not making wireless calls, you're not sending texts or doing anything. And so the way these would work, there were 300 different servers, 100,000 SIM cards already plugged in, ready to go, with about 2 to 3 times as many in boxes ready to be installed. And the way it would have worked is if this thing had been flipped on, it would have been able to overwhelm the wireless network with millions of anonymous text messages and anonymous phone calls to the point that it would just literally crash the network because it would just be overloaded. And this was around the same time as the UN General Assembly was meeting. Some of the major world leaders, including the U.S. president, were there. Mark Carney was there. And imagine having no wireless service in an entire geographic area. It would have been an absolute disaster. And quite frankly, that this was discovered before they were able to flip it on we're incredibly lucky. What scares me here particularly is these aren't just some kids, playing with technology. This is millions of dollars worth of equipment. This is really sophisticated kinds of cyber threat. So it could be, investigators are thinking it could be state-sponsored. It could be someone with an axe to grind. It's essentially, this is kind of like cyber insecurity raised to a terrifying new level. We've got to pay attention. They're going after infrastructure now. This time we got lucky. Next time, maybe not.
By the way, to your point, right, this wasn't some guy, in his basement putting this all together, but there have been no arrests, so there's no foreign entity here necessarily that's been found or any clues to who this might have been, right?
Exactly, and I think part of that is it's the Secret Service. They never say anything as you would expect them not to. And I think the investigation is still continuing. I think they're trying to identify who are the bad guys, who are the threat actors, and trying to dig into that. And of course, saying publicly right now who they think it is would probably compromise that investigation. So it's radio silence for now, but we'll learn more about this over time. And I would suspect that once we learn who it was, it is not going to surprise us at all. I'm willing to bet it's one of the top 4 sponsors of state-sponsored cyber insecurity, either Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran, or maybe some combination of them all.
Well, we shall see. All right, let me get to this next story because I think for every parent who's ever told their child, put down your iPad for a minute, they'll love this story. So this is a pilot on Spirit Airlines, and what happened here?
He was flying over, they were heading to Boston, and they were near Long Island, and as it happened, Air Force One happened to be flying nearby as well on their way to the UK with the president on board. And the air traffic controller was giving instructions to the Spirit pilot and had to repeat those instructions several times to the point that he finally told him to pay attention. And then finally, the air traffic controller got so exasperated because the pilot was not answering him or only answering him after 4 or 5 attempts, he finally told him to, I got to talk to you twice every time, get off the iPad. And so he finally did listen in. He landed safely. Spirit Airlines says that there was never risk of an imminent collision. They got within 11 miles of each other, but it was close enough that ATC raised the alarm. And I think this is an indication. Pilots used to carry like binders and bags filled with their flight plans and their maps and all that. Now they carry iPads, and that has all the software on it that helps them plan their trips, and they kind of have them propped up on the flight deck as they fly. The worry here is that this pilot got a little bit distracted, stopped paying attention to air traffic control. So you can be distracted in the air as well, not just on St. Catherine Street.
Yep, on his iPad. We don't know what. They're never going to let us know if he was playing a game or actually doing work, but yeah, distracted by his iPad. Final story, real quick. We heard this last week. This is in the U.S., but it applies to people here. So the Federal Trade Commission is suing Ticketmaster for allegedly colluding with resellers. This is a story that's been going on forever. Does this make a difference this time around?
I think it will. This one might very well stick because they're going after the owner of Ticketmaster, Live Nation, and they're basically saying that they are helping data brokers, so ticket brokers who swoop in and buy all the tickets within the first couple of minutes of availability, then resell them at scandalous prices on their other platforms. They're saying not only are they looking the other way when this happens, but they're actually providing technical support to these brokers, making it easy for them to goose prices and rip the rest of us off. They've made over $16 billion in fees in the last 6 years alone, and the Federal Trade Commission says it's got to stop. They're suing the company along with 7 states. So this is really big. It will set an important precedent because it is common law. It'll apply across most of Canada as well if this case does end up in a conviction.
Well, a lot of people listening to this think it's about time if it does in fact happen. All right.
Right on. Exactly. I'm sick of being ripped off, and all I want to do is go to a concert.
Carmi Levy, CTV tech analyst. Thank you, Carmi.
Thanks so much, Aaron.
Take good care.
Canadian women are looking for more out of themselves, their businesses, their elected leaders, and the world around them.
And that's why we're thrilled to introduce the Honest Talk podcast.
I'm Jennifer Stewart.
And I'm Catherine Clark. And in this podcast, we interview Canada's most inspiring women.
Entrepreneurs, artists, athletes, politicians, and newsmakers, all at different stages of their journey.
So if you're looking to connect, then we hope you'll join us.
Listen to the Honest Talk podcast on iHeartRadio or wherever you listen to your podcasts.